So with that, let's give a round of applause to Tom Franklin and to Robert Maynard.
Okay, so like Tom said, you have a dream team today. Both Robert and I practice generally in the same area, so we've kind of divided up this presentation. I'm taking some slides, he's taking others, but we want to make this very interactive, especially with the crowd. So we're going to go through the various types of intellectual property. We're going to talk about pitfalls. I think that's an interesting way to kind of get a structure around this, is kind of telling you what you could do wrong and what you should watch out for. We're going to go through a timeline and talk about some timing issues. And then finally, we're going to go through a top 5 list of things you should be worrying about as a small business getting going, and what sort of legal services you might need. So I'm going to turn this over to Robert. He's going to handle the trade secrets and the patents. I'm going to do the copyrights and the trademarks.
All right. So the... Is it on? Okay. So for trade secrets, basically what a trade secret is designed to do is to protect valuable information that that you've kept secret from the misappropriation by others. So, there's really 2 main principles when you're dealing with trade secrets. The first thing is that you have to take reasonable efforts to maintain the secrecy, and then the information itself must have some kind of commercial value. Now, whether that's product plans, vendor lists, computer code, research information, there's lots of examples of types of information that can derive commercial value. And the great thing about a trade secret is that there's no expiration, right? So trade secrets can last forever when they're protected properly. And the one downside about trade secret is it won't protect you from any type of reverse engineering or independent development from others. And once the information's out in the public, you've effectively lost the trade secret, right? Because it's out there. So as long as it was, done by others. So there's 2 sort of canonical examples of what a trade secret, sort of the extreme ends. One is the formula for Coca-Cola, right? I mean, certainly that information derives a mass economic value, yeah. And they go through great lengths to protect that information. The other example is finger licking good example, and it's the Colonel's original recipe. And this just goes to show sort of the extreme lengths that they go through to protect their recipe, right? So they have a custom safe. This thing's almost 800 pounds. They put 2 feet of concrete around it so people can't drill into it. It has motion sensors. It has 2 types of information for accessing it. It's monitored by a security team. So there's all kinds of safeguards they've put in place to protect this type of trade secret. Now, this is an extreme example, right? I mean, all trade secrets don't have this amass commercial value, but still can have value. And the amount of effort that you go through to maintain the secrecy is, in effect, dependent on the commercial value, right? So the more valuable it is, the more you need to do to protect the information. So things you might consider, depending on, is things like putting the information in a safe in a room that has limited access, on a computer that has limited access, having document control where people can't access, it's password protected. Those are kind of other common examples of what might of things you might do to protect trade secrets. And the biggest pitfalls that people have is just not having a plan set up, right? So if you're going to have a trade secret, think about it. And really what you want are signed employment agreements. You don't want employment agreements that are just part of the manual. You want people to actively acknowledge that they're going to be monitoring confidential information or receiving confidential information, and that they have a duty to keep it secret. One of the biggest dangers I've seen for companies is when new hires come on, they're tempted to bring information with them, right, from other companies, right? So things like customer lists, software code, even if it's a small piece that they developed and they just don't want to have to redo, right? So you want to remind any kind of new hire not to bring this type of confidential information with them to your company, because this puts your company at risk. Another thing you can do is periodically review sort of your computer systems for this type of confidential information. Remind employees that they have a duty not to use confidential information. When you have a product about to roll out, you want to ensure that confidential information from another company is not being used. Anytime you're working with vendors, contractors, visitors to your company, that might obtain access to this confidential information, you're going to want non-disclosure agreements, right? These all are things that help protect you from your trade secret becoming public information and you losing your rights. When you have confidential information, you want to label it as confidential, right? So people know that they're looking at confidential information, right? You might want logs to see who had access to it and that it's reminding them that this is confidential information you're about to see, right? So they're signing in, it's kind of a reminder. When an employee leaves and is about to go to another company, right? Again, you want a signed acknowledgement and an exit interview that says, hey, I've seen confidential information, I'm going to keep it confidential, I'm not going to use it and share it with my new company. I don't know, Tom, have you seen other good practices or pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing in the trade secrets is when you go to court, the court is loath to get back your trade secret if you haven't done anything to protect it. So when I worked as an engineer, they could look through my bag, right? And inspect to see if I was taking anything outside the building. And that was presumably part of a trade secret program. But having those steps in place, so when you go to the court and say, hey, look, this employee knew it was confidential, it was labeled confidential. They signed an agreement when they came on board, they signed a reminder when they left. And in fact, after they left, we sent them a letter reminding them. Yet, they showed up in the new company, they immediately started calling all the people on the customer list because they kept a customer list, and we marked it confidential. And you want to have that factual setup if you're going to ask the courts to help you out later. Because, we all, in a startup, things are fast and furious, and some of these things just seem like the least of your worries. So you go back through, and I've seen this with many clients, they go back through and they look at what they now believe is a secret because the person that left is capitalizing upon it. Yet if you look at what they did, they really didn't do anything to protect it. And the court really isn't going to help you at that point. So courts of equity like that like to do what's equitable. And if you haven't done anything to protect your secrets, why the heck should they, right? So you want to set up that factual stuff. And we'll talk about this, and lawyers say you got to do this and that. If trade secrets are a big issue, and you're doing business in here, there's a vault right there. So it's like the KFC vault I was just thinking about. So you sit there and you talk to the people at the vault and you say, hey, that's no longer a conference room. I got to keep that stuff in there. And the documents are labeled secret. And you have the logs, right? So this was the status quo before the patent system. I don't want to steal any of Robert's thunder as he transitions over to that, but that's what they used to do back in the industrial age, is they would carve a factory out of the forest somewhere and they'd set up a company town and all the people would work there. And you could figure out a way to make your widget for half the cost, and you potentially could keep that secret forever. All the employees would work there, they bought all the groceries there, they didn't jump from job to job. They didn't live very long, the machines tended to eat them up. So you could keep something secret forever. So that was kind of the status quo before this innovation that we call the patent system.
Yeah, so it sounds like if there's something you want to protect as a trade secret, you want to be deliberate about it. Is really the important thing. And these are common ways that you might want to do it. But deliberateness is really I think the key word here. Okay,
so I'm on the griddle now. So we're going through these different forms of intellectual property. I think of them as tools, right? And every company has the ability to leverage some or all of these tools, right? Everybody has a trade secret issue. Your customer list, who your employees are. You know, recruiters will pay, I've been told, $500 for an org chart of a big organization because they want to know who to recruit, who the power brokers are. That's a trade secret. So everybody has a trade secret issue. Most companies have at least some sort of copyright issue. So a copyright is anything in a tangible form that's classified as artistic expression. And that's a little bit of a misnomer because lots of things that wouldn't be necessarily self-evident are artistic expression. Software code is artistic expression. Certainly anything that's written, so it might be a product manual that goes along with the product you're selling. It's advertising. It might be a very unique logo. And it's a very narrow right. It prevents people from copying, in essence. So it doesn't prevent somebody from taking your software and implementing that functionality in exactly the same way or largely exactly the same way, but it does prevent them from taking that software and using it with their next employer, right? So it's a very narrow right. But at any rate, it's very clear. It happens all the time with my clients where they'll have a code base and something will creep into that code base that came from somebody else. Either it's open source, something that was available on the internet, maybe it wasn't open source, maybe it was something that a former employer did, and that person coded it up. And you know, I think developers are kind of proud of their code, right? And up until recently, I still had the code that I worked on when I was a developer on my computer. Thinking that somehow I would want to revisit it again, but it's kind of like it sticks with you. Now, there might be a temptation when you get to the next business to say, hey, wait a minute, I've already coded that up. Let me drop that in there. Well, let me tell you what that developer has just done, right? The former employer is probably a competitor, would be my guess. And the competitor now has code in your code base. So in essence, the competitor owns some of your product. So you start mixing it up in litigation, this comes out, it gets real messy real quick. It's very easy to prove. You know, with code, you just can do a compare. And very easy to avoid. But I think it really takes everyone knowing about copyright, how easy it is to avoid. It's just a matter of writing it up on your own and not sitting there with the other competitor's code in front of you. You might just do it as a clean room development where you sit there and say, hey, we want to implement this functionality. You go ahead and implement that functionality. So,
Tom, let me just ask a basic question. In the legal battle fronts that you across the country, how many of them are copyright? How many of them are trademark? How many of them are patents?
Yeah, so the question was, in I guess the litigation landscape in the intellectual property area, how does it break down between patents, copyrights, I guess, trademarks, and trade secrets? And I would say there's kind of two dimensions to that question. You know, sheer numbers, the number of filings, and then the dollars involved. And patent tends to have the biggest dollars involved in those lawsuits, but they're probably far rarer. So you know, legal costs are much more expensive. $3 to $5 million would be a typical spend on a patent litigation. Trademark litigation, probably $800,000. Copyright, you know, depending, is going to be even less than that. Copyright is very clear. I can compare this code to that code. I can compare this song to that song. They tend to be pretty clear issues, and the law is fairly well developed. So I think those tend to get litigated less. If I have a client that they find in their code base the competitor's code, there's not much you can argue about there. Patent's much more nebulous, right? So the legal fees tend to be higher. The amounts tend to be higher. So I think from sheer numbers, I would guess there's probably the most filings in the trademark area. Copyright, probably a close second, but almost all of those settle. Patent, they tend to be bet the company things in most circumstances when they're litigating between direct competitors. Those still have, just on average, 98% of all lawsuits settle. But I would guess far more trademark and copyright and trade secret lawsuits settle because they're so easy to factually prove. The question was, what was the percentage of lawsuits that settle out versus go to court? And it's, just as a general premise, 98% of lawsuits settle. So most of them do. It's just in certain circumstances they tend not to, right? And it just depends what's at stake and what the goals of the parties are. So when you see direct competitors battling, they tend to be the fiercest, most venom-filled types of litigation. So you see, what was it, MCA Entertainment, the Bratz dolls, right? It was two competitors in the same space arguing about who owned the copyright to the Bratz dolls, because the person who developed it was working for one of the companies, Mattel, I think, Mattel, and then they went to work for a competitor, but they had the sketches from the days that they were at Mattel, and those sketches, were done by somebody who was in the business, was hired to develop a new product. So the question was, who owned it, right? And it became a knockdown dragout. I mean, so it's gone several rounds, and it's just the messiest thing now. One of the law firms is being sued by one of the parties because they overbilled and lost, and it's just, they're venom-filled. So in circumstances like that, they tend not to settle because there's a different business purpose at play. They don't want to figure out who owns this. They want to drive their competitor into the ground, and that's what you'll see in a lot in these legal battles, is that it's not the lawyers and the IP just is a tool, a means for an end to beat up on your competitor. Yeah, so there's been many examples. Suffice to say, there's been many examples of these battles, and they tend to be part of a larger play, right? Like right now in the cell phone area, we have this huge food fight, right? And they're going to fight over anything that they can fight over. And IP tends to be something that they like to fight over because even if you lose, you cause your competitor to spend millions of dollars defending the lawsuit. So sometimes the objective is really just death by attorney fee. And so $3 to $5 million, I can sue you on a patent, and if it sort of applies to you, you're going to spend $3 to $5 million over the next couple of years. But maybe I sue you in 12 different jurisdictions or in 12 different countries. And the best example I can think of this, and this dates me a little bit, but I think looking around, half the people in the room will remember this. But remember, there were zip drives, and then the competitor was, there was iOmega zip drives, and who was the competitor that had the similar high-density drives? SideQuest, right? So they litigated in 12 different jurisdictions, and SideQuest ran out of money first. iOmega bottom, really. And the objective may have been from the very get-go was to buy your competitor to get a competitor out of space. Margins are tighter when there's two people in a space. That may have been the objective. But I bet you SideQuest, when they were flying high, had a market cap way up here. Right as they cannot meet payroll, their market cap is down here. So in essence, by spending $1 million a month in legal fees until SideQuest ran out of money, they were able to buy that company at a considerable discount. So, it happens. It happens. So part of why you would talk to Robert or I is to come up with some sort of strategy so that you're not roadkill. There's all these risks in a business, right? And what lawyers do and a lot of professionals and vendors you're going to interact with is we're going to try and take risk out of your business model. I'm happy to say I'm a risk mitigation tool. That's what I am. It sounds fancier to say I'm a lawyer, but what I want to do as inexpensively as possible, take risk out of your equation. So that means looking at your business model and deciding what you need, paying attention to copyrights, trade secrets, all these things in a way that won't break the bank.
Yeah, and even if you're not excited about any of these things for your business, other businesses are. and they're going to be your competitors, and they're going to come at you with a gigantic war chest.
So-
and you need something to fight back with.
Yeah. So what I like to say is, as a startup, you're not on the radar screen of your competitors yet, right? But once you pop on that radar screen, and it becomes worth their while to start messing with you, you want to have your house in order. So what that means is you might have a competitor with a large patent portfolio. Well, they're looking, they're not paying that money to our firms for the fun of it. They're sharpening their knives for that competitor that starts to get traction in that space. And when you're biting enough at their ankles or they're losing enough business to you, they're going to look at litigation as a business tool as they are going to look at other business tools, underpricing you, coming out with a better product, all this stuff. But you certainly want to neutralize. You want to neutralize the ability for them to beat up with you on patents. So, moving right along. So, pitfalls. Marking. Why not put the Circle C? It's not required in the U.S. But certainly it will sway a jury to sit there and say, hey, look, it was marked, they copied it. You might file copyrights as they go into the wild, right? So when you release your product, the code that's on your product, especially if it's accessible to end users, filing a copyright registration. A big pitfall is you might hire a consultant, right, to code up some of your stuff. It's not in your area of expertise. Well, creators of intellectual property, in many cases, by default, own that intellectual property. Copyright is that way. So you come in and you hire a developer to do your web page, right? Almost every company is going to do that. The question is who owns your web page, right? Well, if there's no agreement in place, it's owned by the person who put it together. Well, that's all well and good, but you might want to switch vendors at some point and go to the new vendor. And it'd be nice if the new vendor could take the old stuff and tweak it a little bit and make your website new. Well, that developer is going to come knocking on your door and going to say, hey, wait a minute, there's a copyright violation. I didn't give you the right to modify what I gave you, right? So having an agreement in place, and when you're negotiating with these folks, these web developers, to get that business, they're very motivated and will give you ownership to the copyrights if you just ask for it. But if you use their agreement, I would guarantee you almost always it's going to be silent on this issue. And they just know that, hey, wait a minute, I got a second bite at the apple here. If you go to a different vendor, say everybody really loves your website, and you say, well, gosh, I just want to sell this to a few people, right? Because I paid somebody to develop it and I own it. Well, you don't own it. You procured the right to use it as your web page. Nothing more than that unless there's an agreement to the contrary.
If somebody has a website and they've incorporated widgets, you have widgets that are made in India and Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and it's this combination of code from all over the place, and you're doing it in the United States, or who actually owns all that?
Yeah, so the question is, maybe you're using developers from overseas, it's a mismatch of this and that. You got to be really clean, and it's hard to do when you're trying to do things quickly. So you might have hired somebody in India to do a particular widget. Well, you probably had an agreement with them. Make sure you own all rights to what they produced for you. They may not be willing to do that because they're trying to do this widget for 4 or 5 companies, right? So you got to make a mental note of that. Hey, I can't start selling this, or I can't change my business model or change my use with this web page without going back to them and throwing a few more dollars their way, probably. So you end up being in bed with that vendor a little bit. But no, it'll be a mismatch. Some of it may be open source, but sometimes that open source requires you to open source the remainder of your web development. There are strategies in that area, and we can kind of walk through it. Suffice to say, people just don't do this very clean, right? We'll do open source audits at our firms, And almost every time, if there's a big code base, they've got problems. They've open sourced their product in essence. Now, people may not know about it in the public, so we can do certain things to pull out the open source code, and maybe nobody figures it out. But you're in trouble if your product is a software product, and I do an open source audit during the due diligence representing the buyer, because that deal's going to reprice, would be my guess. Because we might just say, thank you very much, we like your product, but we're just going to, under the open source rights, ask you for a copy of it, and we'll have our developers do the next version. So your pricing went from whatever it was to close to zero. So this can really blow up if you're not very careful about it. So sitting down with somebody and thinking about this stuff and kind of running through your business model, absolutely key. Absolutely key. You've got to be very clean on the copyright issues. So trademarks, I'm going to change gears here. Another one of these tools that we have in our arsenal, one of these IP tools. So it's really anything that's used to identify the source of one's products or services to consumers, right? So I'm sitting here with this can. You see it's red. It's a soda. There's trademark protection probably to that color. Certainly the script of Coca-Cola. One of the earliest trademarks right there to the silhouetted bottle. Apparently it was a very, very big deal. Shaped like a woman, right? And they thought. And really that was the big innovation when it first came out, is the perception was people were buying the product just because of the shape of the bottle. Well, even if you pick up a can today, I see the silhouetted shape there, printed on there. If I see any bottle from across the room and it has that silhouetted shape, I know it's a can or a bottle of Coca-Cola, right? So it's something that indicates to me who's providing that, right? Maybe I don't even see that it's red, it's in a black and white photo. I see that silhouette, I know it's Coca-Cola. So it can be music, can be that way. NBC has that little tone that they play, and you could hear that and just know, right, that you're watching NBC. So it's really anything that tells a consumer who's providing that service. So Harley Davidson a while back wanted to trademark the sound of their mufflers. Well, as it turns out, broken mufflers sound the same way, right? So they were denied in their effort to get a trademark to the sound of their muffler. But you know, another very famous example was the grill on the Jeep. I think it's 5 or 6 horizontal bars, right? So they were pursuing trademark rights on that because Hummer came out with something very similar, right? And they were trying to differentiate themselves from the Hummer brand. I guess not an issue now since Hummer's gone, but nonetheless, they fought it out, right? And you'll even see in Jeep print ads today, they have the symbol. It has the 2 headlights and the spoke pattern because they're really trying to enforce their trademark rights in that. I think that ultimately settled. It was one of these big bet the company battles. It ultimately settled because the government had specified. They were government designs. The government had specified how many bars you would have on the Jeep initially. So really, if anybody was the owner of the trademark, it was perhaps the government. So people will file for federal registration. You'll see the circle R, right? You don't need to file for federal registration. You'll see the TM, right? The difference between the TM and the circle R is that the TM just says, hey, I'm claiming this as a trademark, right? And I'm claiming whatever rights, if any, in it, right? Doing the federal registration gets you certain enhanced rights. It really depends on what your business plan is, where you plan to roll out and stuff like that. Some businesses are all about branding. Trademark is much more important in that area. Some businesses are all about technology. Patents are more important. You know, sitting down and figuring out, here's my risk, here's my business model, where's my risk with regard to intellectual property? So you can sit there and figure out if you want to spend or not spend, right? Certainly, Robert and I can spend every dollar you have, right? So we want to sit there and judiciously figure out what makes sense for your business model at this phase in growth, right? And lay out those options, and then you decide what makes sense, right? So one of the biggest problems that I see is people fall in love with a name for their business before they've properly researched it, right? So they come to me and they say, you know, my name is going to be this. And I was actually just talking with somebody yesterday. In the back of my mind, I'm like, well, you know, I have another client that has the exact same name. You've got a trademark issue right out of the gate, and I know they need to change their name. But it's very hard because humans are funny. We fall in love with names and branding. And that's the whole beauty of it is, you know, I don't even know what this tastes like anymore, but I sit there and I look at that red can and I just say, yum, that's going to be good, right? Branding is funny. It really plays upon the way that the human mind works. So before you fall in love with a name, absolutely make sure you can get the domain name. Because if you can't get the domain name, you're signing up to spending 10, 50, 100 grand to buy off somebody that has that name. And if you figure that out after you've rolled out with your product, the pricing of that went up. So I've had clients that have come to me. One was launching a movie studio and had already picked the name. And guess what? There was a theater student in New York that had the domain name, right? And on the eve of launch, we were just so desperate they wouldn't correspond with us. They didn't know we were launching. Our last-ditch effort was a 50 grand cashier's check sent to his apartment. I'm sure he was starving, with a contract on the back saying, if you sign this check, and he didn't sign the check. We ended up rolling him legally, but nonetheless, so my client ended up owning the name. But certainly come up with a list of names and be very deliberate, because if you pick the wrong name, you will be changing your name. And the question is do you want to change it now when it's meaningless to have this name or that name, or do you want to change it down the line after you've invested all this goodwill in your name and you have to retrain all your customers? You know, marking properly, certainly put in the TM. I'll do business plan competitions. It just irks me if somebody doesn't have, even if it's a made-up academic exercise, you better have TM after your name. There's no good reason not to. Marking guidelines. One of the biggest causes of trademark issues are the things that you do yourself. So Band-Aid, right? That's what I called them when I was a kid. I don't know if you still call them Band-Aid or if you call them plastic bandages. But I think the company Band-Aid was very impressed that everybody started calling the product by their brand name. Well, they call that genericide. It becomes the generic name, generic suicide, so it's genericide. So now they have this crazy jingle that says Band-Aid brand bandages, right? And they sing it in their commercials and so forth, because they're trying to pull it back out of the public domain. And the case law has many examples of people that weren't successful. Escalator used to be a company name. Aspirin. Kleenex. So these are all people, you know, the one that I see happening now is Google seems very flattered that people call searching on the internet Googling, right? Well, there's nothing stopping me from starting a website that says Franklin's Googling service. And I think they would get pretty pissed off if I did that, right? But that's what they're setting themselves up for. You know, this is a very sophisticated company. Well, I mean, yeah, it's a tough problem. I mean, may you be so lucky that your name becomes generic. But at the same time, trying to get it back is very, very difficult. So you'll see people, and we'll often have campaigns for our clients. The flattery is gone, and they realize that people are using it in a way that they didn't want to do, but they've caused their own problem. So having guidelines within the organization, people using it consistently. And then, you know, making sure that you police your mark, making sure that people aren't using your mark in a way that you don't want them to. So you see somebody starting to sell plastic bandages called Band-Aids, right? Well, at that point, alarm bells should go up. And I think that's about when they figured out flattery wasn't good for their business model. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Robert. He's going to tell you about patents.
All right, so patents, like Tom was saying earlier, tend to be the most, when litigation comes, the biggest dollar cost, or biggest dollar cost for litigation, biggest reward potentially. They're also, I think, the most expensive to get when compared to copyrights and trademarks, generally speaking. But what a patent does is it allows you to exclude others from making, selling, offering for sale, the invention that's defined in your patent. And it's not anything disclosed in your patent, it's what's defined in those claims at the very end, right? So oftentimes I see people get very confused because they're like, well, my patent relates to XYZ, but when you look to the claims, it's something very different. So that's something you want to pay attention to when you're either looking at a competitor's patent or one of your own as you're going through the prosecution. It's not anything that's disclosed in there that you're getting protection for. It's the claims at the end that really define, it puts the stake in the ground as to what you're protecting. And the important part, thing to really understand, I think, for a lot of people, is that the patent doesn't allow you to actually practice your invention, right? So it's kind of confusing, right? Because you think, well, I'm getting a patent, I should be able to practice it. But, right, it excludes others. It gives you the right to exclude others from doing it. But see, your patent, in order to practice it, may require the use of other patented technology, right? And I think that that is something you want to be careful of, aware of, when you're thinking about the protection you can get from patents. And there's typically three types of patents. I've listed two here, design patents and utility patents. The third type is a plant patent, which is very esoteric. I'm not sure I've ever met anybody that's prosecuted a plant patent. But the design patents and the utility patents are the most common. The design patents basically have a term of 14 years of protection from the date of issuance. Utility patents is 20 years from the earliest filing date, which the patent claims priority. And the difference between these two is that the design patent allows you to protect the ornamental design, right? It's kind of the look, the feel, the structure, the aesthetic value. Whereas the utility patent is protecting the functionality, right? So it's the thing that actually makes it useful, right? And just to, I think the easiest way to do it is we'll do a couple of examples, right? So this is Crocs, right? I mean, these are things people know. So Crocs has a design patent, right? And what they're doing is they're protecting the way the shoe feels, right? When you see a Crocs shoe, right? When you see the shoe, you immediately think Crocs, right? So it has this very specific look and feel, an ornamental nature. And that's what they're protecting with the design patent. And it's very narrow, right? I mean, you change the way the holes look, the placement of the holes, the number of holes, then it's a different design, right? So this is very narrow, right? So,
But there was lots of enforcement on that particular patent. My partner worked on prosecuting that, and Fegri here in town worked on the litigation. And I know my kids loved those shoes when they first came out, and you'd see them show up in Walmart each once in a while. Well, a couple letters to Walmart, and they didn't show up in Walmart anymore because of that design patent.
yeah. So then as another example, here's an example of a Crocs utility patent, right? So it actually is protecting the functional features, the thing like the strap, the process for manufacturing, the ridges inside. Sorry, the ridges inside that are draining away the water out the holes through the bottom. So these are functional aspects as opposed to the ornamental design. So when you're thinking about your IP, right, there can be, the same item can have multiple levels of IP. You mentioned the cross-light, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, my guess is maybe that's a trade secret, right? Exactly. That should have been probably better than the KFC to tie it all together. Is that here's a case where they have it's different aspects of the same thing, but they have different types of protection. So basically, to get a patent, the patent has to be novel and non-obvious, and this is where a lot of people get themselves in trouble because they'll publish their ideas in articles, They'll offer their idea for sale. They'll put a poster out, an advertising campaign. So all of a sudden now, your idea is out in the public, right? And the US is nice, you get a 1-year grace period for these things. But in the rest of the world, at least most of the rest of the world, you've lost your rights. So you want to be very careful and think about, before you put up a poster describing your idea, you publish an article, if it's a technical idea, you want to think about, what am I doing? Have I already sought protection on this? Am I going to want to seek protection? If someone else has described it in an article identically, that's the novel part, right? You're not going to be able to get a patent on that exact same thing. If a combination of sort of articles teach your idea, then it's going to be difficult to get a patent. And basically, there's a quid pro quo in the patent system for obtaining a patent, right? This is the right to exclude others from making, using, selling, or importing your patent. And to do that, you have to basically divulge to the rest of the world what your idea is, right? So you have to provide a sufficient written description, right, that shows that you had the invention in mind when you wrote the patent. You have to provide enablement. You have to enable others to make and use your invention. And this is oftentimes things I hear is, from inventors is, well, it's like, yeah, when I'm building my mousetrap, I really like to use this particular material, but I don't want to tell the rest of the world because, this is really the thing that makes my mousetrap super light and great. Well, there's a best mode requirement, right? And it's what the inventors think is the best mode of making and using the invention, right? And it's not someone else in the company, it's actually the inventors. And oftentimes they want to kind of keep that back, but you can't, right? That's part of what you're exchanging for these rights.
Yeah, and that, back to my example of the factory town, right? So in the industrial age, that's what you had, is you had a bunch of these factories all over, and they were innovating. And if you're trying to produce the widget that was being produced at half the cost, you're scratching your head and wondering how they do it. And there's no way to figure it out. So they could keep that secret, in essence, forever, right? Chicken doesn't taste as good as KFC's even today, right? And people could argue about that. People love Church's chicken. But at any rate, in essence, under that regime, you could keep things secret forever. So the patent system was an innovation over that. It was basically government striking a bargain with all these folks and saying, hey, we're going to force you to collaborate, or we're going to encourage you to collaborate. And what would it take? Well, I'll tell you what. If you collaborate, you tell people all about your ideas, the best mode of implementing it, and so forth. What we'll do is we'll give you 20 years to make some money back on that. But we know innovation happens quicker when there's cross-pollination. So the patent system forced collaboration to break down what was happening in the industrial age, and the pace of innovation really took off at that point. There's been studies and big spike in innovation at that point where people were collaborating, so you could see what your competitor, your fiercest competitor, was thinking of 18 months earlier. That's how long it takes for a patent to publish. You can look at what they're doing, and you might improve upon that, or you might design around that, but you can be thinking about that rather than scratching your head wondering why that chicken tastes so darn good and figuring out how to break into their vault, because those are the only two options you have.
So here are some questions that I think you should ask before seeking a patent. And so how does this idea fit into the business objective of your company? So right, as a small early stage or startup company, right, it's most common that this is the core idea of the business, the founding product or one of the core products. This is something that the business is revolving around. And as the company grows, the strategy changes, right? So a Google files patents on many things that may not be related to their core technology, but yet may have relevance as part of the war chest later on, something they can sell or license to bring in additional revenue for the company. But I think early on, it's the main idea of your company that you're trying to that you want to protect. The other thing to think about is that patents take a long time, right? I mean, so when we file a patent application, it's anywhere from 2 to 5 years before we receive a first office action, depending on the technology area. So, right, that's a long delay before you even just get probably a denial that we have to go back and forth and fight with. So what's the life cycle of your product? If the product's already going to be extinct by then, it probably doesn't make much sense. If it's something that's going to last much longer, then I think it's worth thinking about a patent. What is the scope of likely protection you're going to be able to get, right? How close is this to something other people are already doing, right? This goes back to the novel and non-obviousness, right? If your idea is already out there, well, even though you came up with it independently, somebody else already did, and it's out in the public, you're not going to be able to protect it. If it's easy to put the pieces together to come up with your idea, right? Then it could be difficult to get a patent. So you want to kind of understand what your competitors are doing, what's out there. Sometimes we recommend things like prior art searches. Those can be valuable to help you get but really today, I mean, things like just spending an hour on Google is a great way to get a feel for that. But as a business, you typically know who your biggest competitors are, if there's a product similar to this, so you have some feel. And that's something that, Tom and I can help walk you through. Well, is this too close? How is yours different from that? We can help you. Even if you think yours is identical, we may see things that are different because we're kind of trained to see differences. So, it's definitely worth talking to us about and bringing that to our attention. Another thing to think about is how easy is it to design around the thing you're going to try to protect, right? If you're trying to protect a red wagon and somebody can go paint it blue, does it being red give you any real commercial advantage, right? I mean, if there's a red one out there. So something to think about with your products, right? How easy.
Sorry, what if you're dealing with an electronic device that obviously can be easily changed just through minor details? I mean, you're dealing with a device that you know as soon as you're on the market is going to be copied in many different ways that you really couldn't hold back.
So the question is, what if you're doing something that can be easily designed around, I think is the way I'm going to paraphrase it. So you've added some innovation, but there's other ways to go about doing it. That's often the case. There's always the old way of doing it, right? You come up with a new innovation, there's always the old way of doing it. There are a couple strategies. It's often nice if you can have a complete blocking patent. You're the first person to get to this stage, and you can write a patent that stops anybody from following you. People call those blocking patents or pioneering patents. But that's often not the case. What you have is you have a fork in the road, and there might be 3 or 4 different ways to go, and you can patent 1 or 2 of the 3 or 4. Often what I recommend in those situations is you might have a patent strategy that's more like a minefield approach, right? They can do it the old way, and they can continue to follow you down the road by doing it the old way, and they double back behind you. Well, they get to the next fork in the road, and you've covered 2 of the 3 directions. Well, at some point, your competitors can't follow you, because you've taken the best features off the table. And you might market around those same best features, right? Our soap detergent cleans stains 20% better in cold water. Well, what you found was there was a good enzyme that works well in cold water and can work in cold water, so you put that on the front of your box. And then you figure out some way to make it clean stains better in warm water, right? And you put that on your box. And people are going into this grocery store to buy their detergent, and they say, well, gosh, I like to wash things in cold water, and the stains never come out, right? So you want to figure out what your innovation is, what your product differentiation is, and you want to protect that differentiation to the extent that you can. Sometimes you can't completely block it. But at some point, you might have 5 key features or 5 less than key features that your competitors can't implement, and all of a sudden, I'm buying your detergent because I just don't know. I mean, I just look at all that stuff it offers.
Well,
So let me rephrase this, and Robert can ask this. So I think the question was, can you keep your what you file as a patent confidential? There's provisional patents and there's non-provisional patents.
claims included, I think.
So the provisional patent basically will never become public unless your patent issues as a patent, right? Or once it becomes public, right, it's published. So there is a way that's called a non-publication request, but which will keep your patent from publishing at 18 months from the earliest priority date. And what that does is it allows you to prosecute in secret, and if a patent never issues, your competitors will never know what you're doing. The exchange for that is that you basically are saying, I don't intend to ever file anywhere else in the world. I'm just going to file here in the U.S. And for companies that are doing that, that is a great strategy. It's no cost. It's a simple checkbox, unless the patent issues, your competitors don't know what you're doing.
So it's 18 months even pending, took 3 years, 2.5
Yeah.
years. So, but 18 months from the provisional.
Yeah, from the earliest priority date. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Is that something you typically recommend? I mean,
Well, it just depends. If you're going to be only in the U.S., only filing in the U.S., it depends on your business model. I always look to see whether you want your competitors to know or you don't want your competitors to know. So if I'm a small startup, I'm raising funding and stuff like that, I tend to want people to know. If I'm a large company, I don't want people to know. I want people to not think I'm filing patents. They'll see my technology, they'll start to copy it. So as I'm laying down my minefield, they're going to tend to want to stand on my landmines. So I like it for large companies to keep things confidential if they're not filing overseas, although those are the ones that tend to want to file overseas. So you just look at it and, size it up, weigh the benefits.
So not as an individual, I really wanted it hidden from anybody. I don't know.
I don't know. If you're trying to raise funding, you're going to be talking about it anyway. You can't get people excited about your idea if you can't talk about it, right? So I like the patent. The patent allows you to then speak at liberty about what's in your patent. And you can start cheerleading about your idea, getting people excited about it, and those people might offer you money, right? So I don't know. People have different strategies. I lay them out, you decide.
Well,
Yeah, so basically it means fees went up a few weeks ago. They went up about 15%, I think. But really there's a lot of things that are changing. For the actual patenting side, the actual patenting process on this end is in 18 months from that date, we're going to go to a first-to-file system. Historically, the U.S. has been a first-to-invent system, right? So it was, even if you didn't file a patent, you could go back and prove that you invented it before the other person invented it, so you should have the patent. But that's changing.
And the first to file has been controversial, I think, especially with startups. And I don't see it that way. I think it's a major advantage to startups in the sense that you can act much more quickly and nimbly than others, right? So you can file a provisional in a day or two, whereas a large company is going to have processes in place that'll probably make it a much longer time period to get something on file, because there's going to be a clear advantage to people that file first. There'll still be ways to perhaps show that that person stole your idea and filed upon it. They saw your poster and filed something upon it, but it's going to be very hard to prove. So if you can file first, you're doing better. Well, you come up with an idea, there's no reason why you can't have a provisional on file in a few days. But when you went public, what I did is I said, God, that's a great idea. I'm going to tweak it a little bit. I'm going to file my own patent. Who invented it? Who invented it later? Well, you just told me about it because we were over a beer, you were talking about it, and you got loose lips. And I sat there and filed on it that night. Who owns it? Well, I probably own it, right? But that was always the risk you ran. You ran risks like that. So I think the takeaway and the thing that you should be changing is you got to file first and ask questions later. And if you had convinced yourself that it wasn't important to file early on, it always was important to file for early on. But people relied on this grace period, thinking it saved them, and it rarely did. That's what they found when they looked back at it, is the first to file won in 98% of the cases when they were later arguing about who invented first.
So your spiral book notations wasn't holding up?
Well, do you keep spiral book notations? Well, there you go. So that's why it wasn't holding up. So exactly. You would have lost before, you'll lose now. So file first, ask questions later. So the question was, why are maintenance fees around? So maintenance fees are sometimes called patent taxes, right? Because it's a tax on the innovation system is one way to look at it, right? The other way to look at it is you don't want a lot of patents sitting there being valid that aren't being commercialized. So you want to force people into thinking at 3.5, 5.5, and 7.5 years, or 3.5, 7.5, and 14.5 years into the period, into the term, you want them to think, hey, is this a good patent or not? Because every patent that's out there potentially gets your competitor worried about it, and they might not release a product in that area. So you want to basically clear out, flush out the bad IP. So in the US, we have some of the lowest patent taxes. Japan, it's more like 40,000. I think in the US, you're going to be into it for $5,000.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah.
It's about $5,000 over the term, but in Japan, it's going to be $40,000. So they heavily tax their innovation system.
And a follow-up with that is if you've got a patent that is no longer valid for you, you don't have to pay it, correct? And then it gets abandoned?
Yeah, so
You save that.
the flip side of that, the comment was, you know, you don't pay your maintenance fees and you save that money and you save that money and you call us up with your new idea, right? So you want to be, they're forcing you to think about that stuff, but they're forcing you a lot less than they are in Japan, for example, or Korea is very high also. The question was how do you pick a patent attorney? And other than saying pick me, Robert probably has a better answer to that. Damn it, pick me. We'll arm wrestle over it. So I'll take the first stab at it. I think really what's crucial is you need to have somebody that understands the technical aspects of your invention. So if you go to somebody that isn't very well trained in understanding your particular invention, and that person bills by the hour, who's going to be more expensive? Somebody that is very well trained on it, perhaps more expensive per hour, but can pick up, hit the key things, and write it up very effectively. So that's what I think both of our firms offer as higher end firms, is that we're going to have people with the right backgrounds. We have very, very deep benches. So this client that I was pitching yesterday, they had 4 or 5 product lines. We brought experts on all those 4 or 5 product lines. And I know, even though our billing rates might be higher than some other firm, I know we're going to be able to write them up more cost effectively and hit on the key issues because we understand all that because we were technically trained in those areas. So I think the key thing in my mind is matching up technical background of your patent attorney with what you're trying to accomplish. And no firm is going to admit that we don't have somebody with the right technical background. But wonder when you come in there with an electronic circuit why there's somebody that has a mechanical degree helping you out with that.
No, I think that is probably the number one question. And I think the sort of the second thing I would look for is, are they interested in understanding my business, right? Because there's a lot to patenting other than the patent itself, what you're trying to protect. And they should be asking questions, and they may be hidden to you, but it's what about your business is making you seek a patent? You know, so we can say, you know, is a patent not right for you, right? I mean, and guide you. Somebody just says, what's your idea? Okay, I'm out, and then wants to head off. I mean,
yeah.
I would not be so excited about that person.
Every vendor that I interact with, I try and understand their business model, right? We make money when we write patents or we file trademarks and so forth. So there's a moral hazard when we talk to you is that every answer seems to be write a patent. That's where I completely turn it around and I sit there and say, what are your business goals and what are you trying to achieve? And how can we do that most cost effectively? And often, you know, we'll start with trade secrets. We arrange these slides in the order of expense on these different tools. And we're going to start with the cheap stuff and say, well, God, maybe you can keep this as your trade secret. I see you got an office at the vault and they got this big, nice vault. And you got something that sounds like chicken. And we know the chicken thing works, right? So we're going to start off there because what I say to clients is, you know, I want you to be my biggest client in 10 years. And I can say today my biggest clients, my 2 biggest clients are the ones that I worked on at my first month at what was Townsend & Townsend & Crew 12 years ago. They're my 2 biggest clients today. And every client I meet, I want them to be that way. So what that means is I'm not going to pitch advice that's good for my business model. I'm going to say, here are the range of things that you could do. Here are the highest risk things to your business model. Let's figure out what kind of budget you have, and let's work on that risk mitigation, because that's all I am as a risk mitigation tool.
Yep. Okay.
So with that, we're not going to get to our timeline, and we're not going to get to our top things to worry about, but they're in your materials. We're going to be around for a few minutes after this. We're happy to answer questions. I think we're both going to be at the showcase.
Yep.
Is that right? So we'll be walking around the showcase, as will be other people from our firms. So stop by our booths. Ask a question. I've got some business cards out there.
Yeah, I have some.
On the back table. Grab a business card. We're happy to buy you lunch and talk through your business model, see what makes sense.